Danny Shaw is a professor of Latin American and Caribbean studies at CUNY, who's lived in the South Bronx for the last 20 years. He took me to El Maestro Boxing Gym, which is a hub of education about the Puerto Rican independence movement, bearing a mural of national heroes and freedom fighters. The desire for sovereignty from U.S. bondage is reflected here in generations young and old.
By converting Puerto Rico into this what's called monocultivo or monoculture sugar-producing island, there's nothing to sustain the population. So the Jibaros, or the peasants of Puerto Rico, are forced to migrate. They face a very harsh environment. Once they get here to Harlem, to the South Bronx, they face widespread bigotry and racism. The Italian-American communities and Irish-American communities that were here saw the Puerto Ricans as the outsiders, as the newcomers. They were chased down the block. They were excluded from neighborhoods.
While the U.S. treated Puerto Ricans as others, they were more than happy to call them equals when sending them to war. When President Wilson granted citizenship in 1917, virtually zero volunteered to fight for their new flag in World War I. So he made it compulsory, and just 2 months later sent around 20,000 to the killing fields. Since then, Puerto Ricans have been sent to die in every U.S. war. Puerto Rican soldiers were also used as guinea pigs for American chemical weapons and drugs. Not only that, but entire islands of Puerto Rico were turned into testing grounds. Culebra, which hundreds of Puerto Ricans called their home, became a practice range for U.S. bombs. When mass community protests forced them to stop, the U.S. Navy simply shifted to the neighboring island of Vieques. In 2000, Puerto Rican environmental activists and Amigos del Mar, or Friends of the Sea, stormed the Statue of Liberty and hung the Puerto Rican flag demanding the U.S. military leave. Today, those islands are plagued with environmental devastation. Cancer rates for the community on the island are astronomical, and unexploded bombs still litter the area. For the Pentagon, Puerto Rico wasn't just a testing ground, but a launch pad.
When you look at the physical location of what we call the Americas, the enter into the Americas is Puerto Rico. It's the first island. So it was military strategy. And that's why the last empire who invited us, which is the US, we've been saying that different from other countries, Puerto Rico do not have US military bases. The whole island is a military base. Okay, show me one invasion to a country in Latin America that do not depart from Puerto Rico. Or the whole issue of training. Before dropping the orange agent in Vietnam, it was tested in Puerto Rico in El Yunque for 10 years. They used Puerto Rico before invading the Dominican Republic. They did the rehearsal in Puerto Rico. Before the invasion in 1965. They did the rehearsal before invading Panama. And we can go on and on. So it's one of the most powerful military strategy location.
The Puerto Rican masses were never willing participants in their colonial subjugation. In the 1930s, the Nationalist Party rose to prominence under the charismatic leadership of Pedro Albizu Campos. But advocating for independence was illegal for U.S. colonies, and Campos was jailed for sedition for the next 26 years. With the nationalist movement growing and hurting corporate profits with mass strikes, U.S. generals ordered several massacres of peaceful demonstrators. At one community march in the town of Ponce in 1937, General Blanton Winship, the appointed dictator of Puerto Rico, ordered the protesters shot. 19 were murdered.
So American colonization, the American repression in Puerto Rico was so intense that if you raised the Puerto Rican flag, just like Palestine today, they could put you in jail. It was illegal. You were on the run. If you even brought up the theme of nationalism, if you were known to be a follower of Don Pedro Albizu Campos, if you talked about this in a barbershop on the street corner, there was something called La Ley de la Mordanza, which translates into the gag order or the gag law. So it was made illegal to even reach these themes.
Despite the repression, by 1950, the popularity of the Nationalist Party and their demands for sovereignty were making American businessmen sweat. So the Pentagon created a plan to wipe out the party's leaders and its members. But the attack was uncovered, And on October 30, 1950, a woman named Blanca Canales led an armed counterattack on a police station in her town of Jayuya. They forced the surrender of the police and committed an intolerable act of defiance, raising the Puerto Rican flag in place of the American flag. The act inspired people to rise up against colonial authorities in cities all across the island. But empires don't give up their profits easily. The Truman administration drowned the rebellion in blood. He ordered the immediate, indiscriminate bombing of Jayuya, and the U.S. military marched in and declared martial law. Nationalist Party members, or anyone remotely sympathetic to them, were rounded up, imprisoned, and worse. Mercilessly crushed with violence by the U.S. military in their homeland, the fight for independence went the only place it could.
So when the Puerto Ricans were in the middle of their uprisings in 1950, 1954, Jayuya, Utuado, over here you see a massive response. And Lolita Lebron and Rafael Cancel Miranda, some of the individuals who this gym is named after, my son Ernesto Rafael has the name of Rafael Cancel Miranda. They say that an attack on us in Puerto Rico is an attack on Puerto Ricans everywhere, and they make a decision in an attempt to say that Puerto Rican blood was worth as much as American blood, and if you were killing our people back home in Puerto Rico, there would be grave consequences to pay here for the top U.S. policymakers.
In 1954, a factory worker named Lolita Lebron led 3 other armed nationalists into the U.S. Congress, unfurled the Puerto Rican flag, and with a cry of "Que viva Puerto Rico Libre," opened fire. 5 congressmen were shot and wounded. The 4 revolutionaries were arrested and given life sentences. Lebron had written in what she thought was her final letter, "I am not sorry. My life I'd give for the freedom of my country. The United States of America is betraying the sacred principles of mankind in their continuous subjugation of my country." By the late 60s, Puerto Rican youth in a group called the Young Lords coalesced into a huge nationalist political organization, most notably here in the South Bronx.
The Young Lords were the maximum incarnation of the Puerto Rican people coming alive here, demanding national liberation, not just in Puerto Rico, but here in the U.S., feeling solidarity with the African American population, with poor whites, with Native communities. And the Young Lords were born in these very streets. It's the contradictions here in the ghettos of America and the most oppressed communities where immigrants are forced to come, that the Young Lords come alive. The Young Lords have as their slogan, "Pa'lante, siempre pa'lante," forward, always forward. And they carry out the independence struggle here in the belly of the beast. And Puerto Ricans came here 30, 40 years ago and they lived in the most neglected communities. And today these same communities are the most neglected. In the early 1970s, the city's sanitation department would pick up trash. But once they got to 86th Street and 96th Street, they said, well, we finished picking up the trash because who lives further uptown? Well, it's the Puerto Ricans and it's the African Americans. But we don't need to go up there. So the Young Lords said, we're going to take power into our own hands. They started picking up all the trash in the public housing, in the streets, and they brought it into the middle of Fifth Ave, and they lit it all on fire. And that forced the city of New York to move further uptown and to pick up the trash. That was called the trash campaign of the early 1970s. There's also the story of Lincoln Hospital. The neglect in the healthcare industry was so intense here in the South Bronx that once again the Young Lords said we're going to take power into our own hands. They invaded a wing of the South Bronx and they set up their own clinics for the people to deal with tuberculosis and other illnesses that were affecting the communities. And they mobilized all of the healthcare workers, and there was strong community support. None of this could have ever been done without the support of the community. So the legacy is very strong and inspiring today. The repression, just like in Puerto Rico, was very intense here. There were outright murders of Young Lord leaders. There was FBI COINTELPRO campaign to divide and conquer. But the Young Lord's legacy definitely lives in another generation of Puerto Ricans today who continue to fight for the independence.
Throughout the 80s, the FBI worked to pick off the leaders that survived COINTELPRO. Political prisoners like Oscar Lopez Rivera still languish in U.S. prison, as he has for over 35 years. Today, the FBI continues to relentlessly spy on and attack Puerto Rican liberation activists. All the while, U.S. corporations continue to cash in on the huge tax incentives to move their production to the colony. But in 2006, when those corporations decided to leave for even bigger profits, it immediately triggered a recession. Unemployment surged. Luckily for U.S. multimillionaires, Congress made Puerto Rico's debt tax-free too, so it was bought up by drooling American investors, hedge funds, and Wall Street banks. They knew their investment would one day pay off, when they could have the government put a knife to the throat of the island.
So when you look at what came out of the USA Congress last week, it's a plan to give back the money to Wall Street. But how it's going to happen? You have to take away social investment. Keep in mind that also they're trying to deal with something that is not so clear, like the country that is negotiating the $72 billion debt, the U.S. have the biggest debt in the whole world, $18 trillion, and nobody's saying nothing. But then the solution, take away investment in people. And when we say investment, social investment, is always, like for example, Puerto Rico, one of the measures that is going to happen is that they need to fire 100,000 public employees. What's going to happen with those people? Mm-hmm. And this is nothing new. It's been happening, but they're not paying attention. Okay? Incredible. It has to be something like this so-called $72 billion that make things visible, because Wall Street is crying. If not, nobody's going to see this.
And also just it kind of is going along with this whole neoliberal doctrine that we've seen play out over the last 30 years. You know, it's Detroit, all these cities in Michigan that are getting taken over by emergency management systems. And then it seems like Puerto Rico, it almost seems like hedge fund managers in Wall Street want Puerto Rico to default, because then they can go seize more of the land, privatize more of the resources. I mean, what kind of incentivization is being given to Wall Street and just like private business owners to move in and kind of take advantage of the situation?
They give you a tax break for 10 years, no more than that. You don't pay taxes there, you don't pay taxes here. But then this incentive started in the 40s. And you can't show me one of these corporations paying taxes. And then you say, but the laws say that after 10 years, yeah, but before the 10 years, they're going to change in the name of the corporation, and then we have to start again.
The U.S. recession in 2007 deepened Puerto Rico's hardships.
We have 4 million Puerto Ricans in the U.S. and 4 million in Puerto Rico. We have half of the population out. Someone needs to come and say, what's wrong?
When the United States gets a flu, Puerto Rico gets an pneumonia, because what they do is they transfer the social contradictions or the loss of profits, they transfer them down to Puerto Rico. So Puerto Rico is twice as poor as any state in the United States, twice as poor as Mississippi. I mean, it's very ironic that the very individuals responsible for the disease would claim to come with the cure. Puerto Rico doesn't have a $70 billion debt. It's the U.S. government and the U.S. policymakers and the exploiters that have the $70 billion debt. Puerto Rico is owed reparations for years and years of outright pillage, of theft, of exploitation of the Puerto Rican, the Jibaro, the peasant. The pharmaceutical industry has been thriving for decades in Puerto Rico, where Pfizer and Johnson & Johnson have corporate loopholes, tax loopholes. So all that money is owed to the Puerto Rican people. We can't imagine a solution with the contemporary relationship that exists between the U.S. government or the colonial overlords of Puerto Rico and the Puerto Rican people.
Colony is the problem. It's not the death. Death is a symptom. We need to find a solution to the real problem, which is the colonial status in Puerto Rico, that the U.S. do not want us to find a solution. So that's where the main issue is, but they don't want to go there. One of the things that we've been saying, that a colonial status is a declaration of war, which means we Puerto Ricans, we have a right by any means necessary to decolonize the country because you declare the war. Because